Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending the post-legislative wrap-up of the 2019 session, a session that we saw in Minnesota as the only divided government in the United States, which is crazy to think that this is the only one in the United States, and they made it work. The Republicans got a lot of things they wanted. The Democrats got some important things that they wanted, including education and a few other important items. So. With that, we'll turn it right over to Senator Dahms and Representative Swedzinski.
Well, thank you, Brad. We certainly appreciate the Chamber hosting this for us again this year. Thank the Chamber for that, and also like to thank the YMCA for allowing us to use the premises here. We certainly do appreciate that. Certainly want to welcome everybody here today. It was a very interesting session. It started out pretty fast right from the beginning and stayed that way right to the end. We actually ended up having a one-day special session. That special session was held the Friday, it must have been about the 24th of May. We did go into recess at Monday night at midnight. According to the statute, we had to do that, so we did. And then we had Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday to finish up the balance of the bills and get them to the floor, both the House and Senate, on Friday. The agreement was actually, we come together with the agreement, and then a lot of that agreement involved not just the dollars, but involved some of the policy that was floating around. Typically on a budget year, we don't do that much policy. Most of the policy is done in a policy year with the bonding, which is next year. But the DFL decided this year that they wanted to put a lot of policy in the bills, and so that was another piece we had to contend with. Sunday evening about 4 o'clock or so, we come together with the governor and the House. We got together on a deal, and it was a deal that I don't think anybody was real excited about, but yet on the other hand, everybody could live with it. And usually those are when you have a pretty good deal at that point, when there's nobody jumping up and excited about what they got, and nobody really beating the dogs because they didn't get what they got. So it actually ended up to be a pretty good program. At the end of the day, there was some things that I think that everybody did appreciate. When we get to the tax bill, we did have a tax bill last year, and if you remember, the governor vetoed the tax bill last year, and so that $491 million was moved over into the reserve. So we did take that back out of the reserve this year and use that partially for some of our tax reductions. This is the first time, I believe, in 20 years that we've actually had a middle to a low income tax reduction. It's been a long time. It is a small reduction, but it does add up when you look at the total dollars. It's several $1 million to do that reduction. Also, again, this year we were able to continue with the small business, the Minnesota state business property tax. So we have a $50 million reduction on that again this year, and that'll be for this coming biennium. The education, the referendums that the agricultural land is exempted is at 40% at this point. That has been moved to 70%, but it's on a fluctuating. It will start in 2021. It'll go from 40 to 50%. In 22, it adds another 5%, goes to 55. In 23, it'll go to 60%, and then in 24, it'll go to 70%. I do have a little concern about that, and that concern is when we get into tough times, I hope that we don't see people coming in and wanting to grab those tax dollars real quick, because that is a large sum of money to do that. And it's one that's, I think, sits there pretty vulnerable at a point in time when we get into a deficit. But other than that, education, we come up, I felt, with a pretty good education bill. We were able to get two and two on the formula. We put 700 and some million in tails into the education, plus we put almost 600 million in new money, so we put pretty close to $1.3 billion additional money from the last biennium in education, and like I say, 2% of that went in each year, 2 and 2. So a student in Marshall is going to get the same amount of dollars as a student in Minnetonka. And that's always been very important to me, is that the our rural schools get the same increase as what our metro schools do, and the only way we can do that is put it on the basic formula. There was also $90 million put into special education this year to help bolster that up, and that's also on a per student basis, and that's above and beyond the 2%. There were several other things that did happen, but I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he can summarize some things, and then we'll open it up for questions and go from there. So, Chris.
Super. Thank you, Gary. Do I need to hold this like that, or can we kind of set it in between, or is that fine? It'll pick us up. Feels odd holding a phone like that or whatever it is. Thanks again for everyone coming today, and to the farmers in the group, sad that you're not in the field, and I'm sad that I'm not there either, but we had a very interesting session. Started actually off kind of an interesting note. So one of the first things we did this last session was pass a bonding bill, essentially, and so that was kind of a cleanup from last year. So in last year's bonding bill, we had tried to tweak the kind of the legacy amendment portion of the bill, the money that's collected on the sales tax, because there is provision in there to do water treatment projects. And that's the ability to bond those, and so we had about $60 million in projects across the state that worked with water treatment, which obviously you think about clean water in the state. Water treatment is obviously a big part of that. And the Marshall project was one of those projects that was kind of part of a litigation lawsuit that was taken up by some groups that didn't want those particular dollars at the state level to be utilized for it, even though it's pretty clear that it does. And so through some negotiation, we created a new bonding bill, which essentially took that subset of bills, which I think the Marshall project was one of the top tier projects on that, and passed that through. So, I think for 16A in Southwest Minnesota, I think that was, I think 11 or 12 or $1 million of that $60 million was for within the district that we're sitting in. So a fairly large portion of that bill greatly benefited our area of the state. So kind of started on a very unique note to kind of do a bonding bill first, and then move throughout the rest of the process. And so that kind of really set the stage. There was a lot of policy on both sides of the aisle. Obviously, I have a little bit different perspective just from kind of the viewing. I was sitting in the minority in the Senate, so that was, Brad mentioned that earlier, kind of more of a unique where we, as a split legislature, we've had it sometimes where we had a split legislator where the Senate, so taking kind of a backseat role in the House was obviously new. So my perspective was I had a lot of important bills that I had carried in the past that became law. But being a smart legislator, sometimes the best thing to do when you're in the minority is find a good Democrat to maybe carry some of those policy positions that are maybe a little less partisan to get them over the line. And so we had a number of bills that we let some Democrats, young Democrats and experienced Democrats carry, and got them passed into law. And on the Senate side, we had Republicans carrying those bills. So when you're looking at doing that, sometimes that's what you can do. And so when you sign a bill as number 2 or 3 or don't sign it at all, it becomes law, and it's been a priority of yours for a long time. It's a good thing. So mental health, that was one of the areas in agriculture that we'd worked hard on in years past, and we were able to pass that torch on and actually gain some funding for grants for rural health, but also particularly there was a staff person that we only have one person that's dedicated in agricultural mental health, and so finding some funding for them was important, and also noxious weed programming from a county perspective. That was a bill we'd worked hard on to help move some of those things forward. So very basic stuff, and some areas in the tax bill that affect agriculture. Gary touched on a bit of it, and some tax changes. Obviously, 179 deductions, elimination, federal conformity was our goal. I carried an amendment on the House floor that would have done that, but with final negotiations wrapped up, it was really hard to change the bills, and that was a little more unique way to finish session, I would say, in how that wound up. We had conference committees formed, but a lot of decisions kind of happened at the top, and at the end of the day, you have to get the decision makers in a room to negotiate the final set of what the bills are going to look like, because there are a lot of moving pieces, because oftentimes you don't necessarily horse trade within a particular bill. So you may trade a tax provision for a policy position in a HHS bill or whatever. So kind of the way that uniquely changes the dynamic at the Capitol is unique, but to a large extent. You know, it is one of the smaller growth, sessions as far as the budget's concerned, which is a good thing. An area which I was a little disappointed is that the reinstatement of the health care access fund, the provider tax came back. That was due to eliminate. We had worked really hard at that at the beginning in like 2011, 2012 to eliminate that tax on healthcare. So if you're going in for cancer treatments or heart surgery, you pay a 2% tax on that, whether it's you or your provider or your dentist or whatever that might be. And that tax got expanded a bit and reinstated for perpetuity. So that's how it goes. You win some and you lose some, but you know, and we got rid of a lot of bad policy, whether it be in energy and a lot of other areas. So this is your day. You guys can talk, and so we'll open it up to questions from the floor and let her go. So if anyone wants to speak, go ahead.
Brad.
Again, thanks for being here and all your work at the Capitol. One of those, in my eyes, bad policy would be the FML mandates that, paid leave, that sort of thing. Can you talk about the impact that would be on businesses? There would have to be another, from my understanding, a new department created just to, and it would be basically you replace these mid-Mars employees with a new agency and the tax burden actually on employees as well.
Yeah.
Well,
Right, if you want to.
We didn't get anything, we didn't move forward with that because it still needs an awful lot of work. But what the House was proposing would be to set up a system similar to unemployment insurance. And it would require 500 new employees to set it up and cost about $63 million to set it up. And then once it was set up, then there would be a charge to the employer like there is on unemployment. And the number started out around that 2%, but it was quickly up in the neighborhood of 5 to 6%. So it'd be like putting a new tax on the employers of somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6%. There were a lot of other issues with the process and with the program. There was too many unknowns and too many guessing of what was going to happen. And it's going to be back next year again. There's another option that we were looking at in the Senate, and that was there are a couple of companies that do sell family leave programs, and it's similar to what short-term disability is. And so we were looking at trying to put together a program to where the private industry would handle it, and as an employer, if you wanted to offer it, you could offer it to your employees. And if you, as an employer, wanted to, for instance, pay part of the premium, you could do that. That would be left up to the employer. And then if the employee chose to go into the program, they would have some skin in the game too as far as paying part of that premium. That was slow to develop, and it's still in the works of seeing what we can get done there. One of the other issues that was coming up was in order to make this work, everybody had to participate. So let's say that you're an employer and you have a program now that would qualify to substitute for the state program. Then you had to pay a penalty of a certain percent. And that was being estimated, started out at the 2%, but as the day went on, it grew basically the same as if you were in the program. There might have been a couple of cents. Once it got to the 6%, it was looking like it would cost the person in a penalty 4% if they weren't participating, even though they had their own program. So you can see this thing has a lot of work to do, but also it is not going to go away. It's something that we're going to have to figure something out. So we need to figure out something that we can keep, in my opinion, in the private industry and keep it as an option that as an employer you can offer as a benefit and pay whatever percent you want to pay versus forcing it like unemployment. When we start putting another department together with 500 people, the dollar signs are just going to keep ringing. And I can tell you, if the estimate is 63 million, that's not where it's going to be at. it's going to be considerably more than that. That's just the way the process usually works. So, Chris, if you
Yeah,
want to add.
And just some of the big concerns that we found was what some of the proposals would do is essentially allow an employee to have worked, a number of months at a job and then take the benefit, which could be up to 24 weeks of a year, and then it starts again at the new year. So if that person still was going through the same issues the next year, that they could sandwich together almost 48 weeks of paid leave. I mean, the opportunities for abuse, I think, are exceptionally high, and the costs are exceptionally high as well. And it really a lot of limitations on employers. So let's say I have someone that's gone for 48 weeks. It says you have to hold that job for that person no matter what. And if you're a small mom and pop shop, how do you compete? How do you find a new person and then hold that and expect to train that person and all these other particular issues that, and that was the problem. It wasn't just, Fortune 500 companies who have enough market share that were going to do this. I mean, a lot of those companies already offer it, but it'd be small folks that, we heard from small businesses in committee that said, hey, I really want this. Well, then good, offer it. Don't expect everyone to be able to fit your mold that, and I think that's you use a small business and a big business and say we want to do it. Well, that's great. There's also freedom in the market, and to put, and this would put small businesses at risk, nursing homes at risk, but also it'd be an unfunded mandate onto local governments. And so cities and counties, I mean, I think the costs from the city and county level was, tens or if not hundreds of millions of dollars of unfunded mandate from the state. So, that's a big concern when it comes to local taxpayers and the rest. So not only would a tax business be paying for the increased cost of that for their own employees, but then they'd be paying that increased cost to the local government as a mandate from the state, and that's just simply not right. And I understand it's a popular thing and people kind of want it and say, hey, I want this, but we're already at one of the top tax states in the country, and you add that on top of it, and you're a business in Southwest Minnesota. What makes a difference in St. Paul and Minneapolis is one thing from a business perspective, but when you have businesses making choices like popular ones in the area do every single day, that's a big concern. And so, I think I agree with Gary. I think it's something that's probably on the radar screen, but we need to maybe encourage businesses to go out and find those products on their own and, help it along that way, but certainly not have a state-led one-size-fits-all program that's going to, quite frankly, I mean, the opportunity for a MNLARS repeat is exceptionally strong with that. And starting with a new program that's never been tried before, I think really puts a lot of businesses at risk, and it's not in the best interest of the state to do it. So, anybody else?
Other questions? Rick?
One of the things that always comes up is the transportation. AMC sent out resolutions to try to get that from all 87 counties to increase funding. We had Commissioner Anderson there talking about the 20-cent gas tax. I don't think people always understood where, out of that 20 cents, how that was all getting divided up, that 9 cents out of every 20 was going to go for paying off bonds. It really wasn't going back into roads, even though we know we need to do something on our roads. What do you guys see for going for transportation and how we're going to deal with this?
Sure. Well, one of the good things that we were able to do is keep the general fund spending in transportation. So, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars that come out of the general fund now from our last budget. And keep maintaining that and keeping it really sets a good precedence that, we can protect transportation funding from the general fund. And a lot of that, so in the budget, when they said they were going to raise it by 20 cents, was that they were also going to strip out that general fund. So all you're going to do is take about 7 or 9 cents of that tax increase and then strip out the spending that's in the general fund and spend it on other things. So you're only seeing a real increase of maybe, half of that, which, is kind of tongue-in-cheek, where you're stripping funding out, using it on other things, and then in tax policy, and then using like family tax credit. So the family tax credit, which is essentially a welfare program through the tax bill, which simply writes checks to people through the tax program, unattached. So it's not like a food program. It's not like any other program that's kind of directly tied to a program. It's just cash to folks, which that's great, fine, whatever. But they say, well, they don't want to use general fund money for transportation, but yet they use general fund money to reimburse families that are lower income with general fund money because of the negative impact that the gas tax increase is going to have of tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So, there's a lot of shifting within the tax bill that was going to happen to, essentially pay off folks that it was going to negatively affect. And that's, a large part of what we saw. We've already seen a large tax increase on the rich. So they've seen that when Democrats were in total control of this last session, 2 sessions ago, we saw a large tax increase. And so where else do you go? So, the governor's proposals were to go to fees and taxes and to the tune, I think, $12 billion when we had over a $1.5 billion surplus. And so, that's what you're going to see. So you have a choice. You either make it work with the dollars you have, or you're going to just continue to grow government at, beyond the rate of inflation, which, if your personal income grows that fast, I think you'd have a great year, but it doesn't. And so we need to keep those things in check. And also, from a pot perspective of where the funding goes, it goes into a lot of other things besides, whether it be environmental impact stuff. So if you're putting up 10 new miles of road and there might be $300,000 is put into putting up tarps and things that are negatively affect the environment. Well, I think that's important, but I think we should be looking at other areas for clean water that would pay for that portion of the project. So if we're mandating through law or through rule that you have to do all these mitigation things from an environmental perspective when you're doing a transportation, a road project, that shouldn't come out of the tax, that shouldn't come out of the gas tax. That should come out of a fund that's dedicated to clean water. And so there's different ways that we should be looking at is to concentrate. And the same issue we have with cities or counties that have sales tax on construction materials or school districts. Like technically we have sales tax exemption for those entities, but you have a lump sum contract. The same thing works in transportation, that if you go out, the state or a county or whomever that might be, if they're going out and doing a lump sum contract on a road construction project, so if they're putting in a bunch of roads or a bridge or whatever that might be, and the entity is out actually purchasing those construction materials, we're paying a sales tax. So we're taking gas tax money, which is a dedicated fund, and then paying sales tax on those materials that then just go back into the general fund. So we should be eliminating that sales tax portion so that we're not having hundreds of millions of dollars just sucked out of the gas tax, which is dedicated and great, but then why are we spending sales tax dollars out of those funds at different levels of government to go back in the general fund? Well, because it's the general fund. So I think there's a lot of hidden things. We call that, some people, it's been called efficiencies, but like that's a real, if we're going to really let's have a real conversation about that eliminates all those extra costs and anything that's oscillatory beyond a culvert or a bridge or concrete or tar, and say, is this really the place? And if we change the rule enough that it costs, when it used to cost $5,000 for a certain amount of road, and now it costs 10 because of the regulation and the rules from different agencies, then we should really be looking at who pays for that extra cost. Should it be the gas tax account, or should it be the agency, or should it be another area of the state where we do have a lot of dollars flowing into the state? So.
And Chris had mentioned about the sales tax that come out of the general fund, and actually 2 years ago we took half of the sales tax from parts and accessories and automobiles, half of the sales tax from rental, and half the sales tax from leasing cars, and put that into transportation, and that equals almost an 8 cents a gallon, equivalent to an 8 cents a gallon gas tax. So we were quite concerned about losing that this year, and fortunately at the end of the day that was part of the negotiations, and we did keep that in the transportation. And that is statutorily dedicated, but that's different than what the gas tax is. The gas tax is constitutionally dedicated. However, there's been some leakage that we're discovering in the gas tax that tax may not necessarily being used as to what the Constitution defined it should be used for. So there will be a study within the next year or so. There will be a study that will be being done to track that money and see what percent's actually going for transportation the way it's supposed to, and what percent is going to things that are not in part of that dedication. So that'll be something we want to find that out too. But I think if now that we've got another 2-year period coming, moving those sales tax into the transportation, I think that's something now maybe we'll be able to keep intact. And I think that that is good, and if we need to do something, we can take a higher percentage of that sales tax and continue to move that to transportation. Originally, that portion of the sales tax went to transportation years ago, and then when the tough times come along, why that was taken back out of transportation. But and I think we put about 100 million new money in this year in transportation, also above and beyond what goes in each year through through the gas tax and through the dedicated tax from the sales tax piece. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
As it relates to me or?
Go ahead. Yes.
Just thinking back in transportation, there's still roads like in Redwood County down by Walnut Road. There's still bridges that are out from last spring's flooding. Mm-hmm. Not counting what's happening with this spring's flooding.
Yep.
You know, I understand taxes and budgets, but what are we actually doing to get those resolved? Like the area around Walnut Road where I grew up, they depend on the pageant, the Wilder pageant. That's their main source of income for the year. And now Highway 14's tore up, the road out to the Wilder pageants got a culvert out, and the road coming north off the detour, the bridge has been out since last spring. What are we actually doing to get some of that stuff fixed? Because it's not good for families, it's not good for farmers, it's not good for emergency services, it's not good for business to have that stuff down.
The road you're referring to down there, is that because of funding, or is that because there's some issues right now trying to get that bridge replaced?
It's probably a little bit of both. I mean, you can't do it right now because it's still flooded, but you know, there was all that time, there was plenty of time last year. I understand you gotta put stuff out for bids, but geez, it seems like it shouldn't take a year to put a new culvert in some places.
Is that the
Because the one by the Wilder pageant is
yeah,
the
but
culvert, the one north
I
of
thought that was a road that there's some issues between the department, the highway department, and the county. Now, I might be wrong. I thought that was the road that they contacted me on. I might be wrong on that.
But there's, you know, that stuff, that's just two that I can think of off the top of my head. You go drive around in rural Minnesota, around here, there is roads closed everywhere. There are shoulders that are falling off into the ditches. There's culverts out all over the place. It's, you know, it's not isolated, it's widespread.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, yeah, part of it's the conditions today because it's still awful.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that stuff needs to get fixed. And I'm just wondering, you know, beyond all the budget talks and the gas tax talks, what are we going to do to actually get that resolved?
Well, that's why we've been putting additional money in, considerably additional money in. In 17, we put the most amount new money into transportation. Previous to that, you have to go back several years to see that high number of dollars. Typically on a year like this, we don't do bonding, so we put a very small amount in. We put over 100 million new money in again this year. It's a big source to feed, but we're trying to feed it as much as we can, and we have increased the money going into transportation considerably last biennium and will again this biennium. Next year will be a bonding bill, and we'll do probably considerable amount of bonding. And that's where a good share of the transportation money does come from, is through bonding, and then of course we get some from the federal and then our state. So there's many dollars goes into transportation, but it takes a lot of dollars. Other questions, Sharon?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple items that you both worked on and we're really appreciative of. Representative Swedzinski mentioned the bonding bill. That provided a $7 million TSIG grant, which is Point Source Implementation Grant. The water treatment plant is currently out for bid, and it'll come in real handy for us because what we've seen, especially with our wastewater treatment bids, is a lot of market volatility. Our wastewater treatment facility upgrades, I should say it's more of a equipment repair and renovation because the equipment is 25 years old. But 2 years ago, it was a $9.5 million estimate. The bids that were accepted were $14 million. So hopefully with our water treatment plant, we don't see that big of a variance, but we are anticipating a little higher than expected project cost for that. So the bonding fix that we did is really made that, hopefully makes this project come to life. as far as the environmental impacts, we know that there's a lot of chloride that goes into the Red River. We estimate about 11 to 13,000 pounds of salt daily. So we're going to need the consumers and residents of Marshall to help us a little bit with that, but it'll definitely help what we're putting into the Red River, making it a cleaner discharge into the river. And then I came in late, so I apologize, but I don't know if you mentioned this, but the local government aid that you provided to cities and counties, I don't know what Lyon County got for the city of Marshall. It's about 115,000. That equates to about a 1.76% levy increase. So it'll definitely help as we do our 2020 budget. One of the things that we'll propose to the council is debt reduction or a levy reduction. And either way, it's going to help property taxpayers in the city of Marshall. So I just wanted to extend our thanks for the work that you did this year. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
On tax conformity, what areas of federal legislation is the state now going to conform with?
Well, there was,
A few things, standard deduction.
there's some stuff that is going to. We were trying to get, one of the big parts that I had mentioned earlier was the 179 deduction stuff. Right now we have a 5-year window that you can claim that and move it all up to the front year, but sadly that was going to cost, I think, $179 million. So that was a pretty big part of what we were shooting for, to try to gain as much on that. It's from the estates tax. We were attempting to have federal conformity on the estates. Currently in agriculture, I think we have some fairly close. If you have an active farm and that land's being passed, we have some fairly close conformity, but to a large extent for the rest of it, if you're a small town business or manufacturer or whatever, you don't have a lot of those same things. And so
Going forward,
not as much as we would have liked, so.
So going forward, the Section 179 is a very high priority. And I don't know just how this is going to work, but there is some changes in the Section 179 that will give you some advantage in the first year depreciation. But it is depreciated out. I think it's depreciated out over 5 years now. But the goal is to conform eventually to the federal. So
keep in mind there's been such a disparity for a number of years that many taxpayers have a large buildup that they're still looking to work off.
Correct.
In the coming years.
Yeah. Yep. And that makes
In terms of individual tax preparation, the federal standard deduction.
Oh, yeah.
That comply with that.
We have large.
Minnesota had some relief to taxable Social Security. Was that just maintained or was that increased?
So that was one of the first things we had done 2 years ago, was begin that process. And so when you're working on the Social Security tax, you've got a lot of folks that simply don't pay taxes because their incomes are low enough that they don't pay any tax on their Social Security, and then start expanding that past that point. And so the first bite we were able to take, I think it affected about 75,000 taxpayers to start the elimination of the Social Security tax, which we're one of, I think, 5 or 6 states that still do that. And so now I don't believe that any of that moved forward, or maybe a portion that simply extended that a little bit, so moved it past that 74,000 of exemptions and moved it past that. It just, I was not in the negotiating room. That's something we've been working hard on to do.
Any conversation on the difference between the 1031 like-kind exchange rules between federal and state?
Well, it's, that I don't think made it into the bill, but that's for the 1031 exchange. So that would be, for folks that don't know, if you have a piece of property and you sell it, maybe you live closer to the Twin Cities, and it's not longer going to be a housing development, but it's going to be not going to be a farm, but a housing development. So maybe it sells for $30,000. You can take that tax-free and maintain your farm and move it to.
Most of the non-conformity was in the area of personal property.
Okay.
And that's just caused a significant complexity in the preparation side.
Certainly.
As well as an ongoing disparity. If you you start a long-term asset with a different set of rules in Minnesota versus the federal, you're really maintaining two independent depreciation schedules for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Social Security was a very small change. We were working on a larger change, but it ended up being it moved it up $650 per individual, increased the deduction another $650 per individual per year. So it's a very modest change, but just that little change cost $10 million. But it did move it up, but very little, $650 per individual. Yep. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Just want to thank you guys again, Representative Swedzinski, for your lead in the Energy Committee on the minority side. And it was tough work this session. And Senator Dahms for your work in the Conference Committee on Energy Issues. What are the chances with the leads that are in the Energy Committee right now of actually addressing some of the conservation improvement programs that the co-ops and the munis put together this last year to reform the programs? It seems like the Walz administration decided to double down on bad policy that was brought from the Plenty Pool administration and even before that. And just wondering if there's any chance with the leadership that's there now with Representative Enius and Representative Long to actually get something that would benefit rural Minnesota.
Sure. Well, I think particularly that was an area where negotiations could have potentially worked, but we saw very little give, particularly on that side of the aisle. There's a lot of different things that we could have probably come to agreement on in the energy area. Obviously, I wasn't in the room, but that area particularly, from SIP or solar program or community solar or the rest, there was a fair amount of things that were on the table, non-contiguous counties. So that would have been, the community solar program is limited to where it can be at. So from an investor standpoint to a contiguous county. So if let's say you live in Hennepin County, you have to put the project in either the county that you're in or a county that's connected to you. And folks wanted to change that so it could come anywhere. I'm not necessarily a big fan of that. I think we should be focusing in on not using prime farmland for a lot of those projects. From an ag perspective, as a young farmer who's trying to find access to grow a farm and grow an operation, having the state or having large energy companies like Warren Buffett or folks from out west competing with me because of a state mandated program that's exceptionally, some of the most expensive solar in the country, in the world, doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a competition standpoint. Granted, it's a willing buyer, willing seller, but when it comes because of the government pushing it, I don't appreciate that a whole lot. And the same with the legacy program as well. Those are some issues that we need to deal with. And when it comes to energy policy and energy issues, when it comes to solar programs, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of acres that are going to be taken out of production. And if we don't get this right on the beginning side, like in southwest Minnesota, I think we have room to put solar in, but it shouldn't be in prime farmland. It should be in mediocre stuff, hillsides. It should be the same places that you'd normally put CRP or other programs. It should be in the buffers. It should be, if somehow the buffer program survives the courts, that's where it should possibly be. It should be mandated that if we're going to force those things and forcing the taking of land and private property, that if we're going to have a government program that wants to focus on solar, that it should be going on those exact same acres. And so there's a lot of issues, particularly in those areas, inefficiencies, but also reliability within the marketplace, and reliability of production that we have to face as a country. And we can have set high goals. Governor Walz had pretty big ideas when it came to getting rid of the carbon in our generations throughout the country. And there was simply no negotiations in a lot of those areas that I think that they could add some wins and we could add some wins, particularly in the SIP reform and the rest, but there was just absolutely no movement. And quite frankly, I don't think there will be. We have a group of folks, and it's a high raising area. That party raises a lot of money from people that believe in that stuff and are heavily invested in that stuff. You look at the community solar program particularly, it's estimated that I think 80 or 85% of it is outside owned. So it's folks that are coming into the state because of the state mandate, which is 12.5 sense. So right now you can build industrial solar on a large scale. So the bigger projects you're seeing around the Marshall area, I think at 3.5 to 4 cents a kilowatt. The state is mandating through the community solar program that the folks that build the community solar project are reimbursed almost 4 or 5 times that rate. So if you can build it for 3 cents, which your people are paying for, which your constituents, whether you're or not a cooperative, but if you're an Excel customer, or you can build it for 3.5 cents or 12 cents, what makes the best sense from a market perspective? You know, if you're a competitive market, which we are, Southwest Minnesota, you know, you look at ADM, you look at the large energy producers and consumers, you know, we're exceptionally expensive. I've talked to a lot of large industries from Southwest Minnesota, and right here, of all their plants across the country, we're some of the most expensively produced electricity in the country. We're the most expensive place for them to do business. And the market managers of these plants say, Chris, you know, I'm getting hammered because all my competitors within my own business, so if they have a plant here, they have a plant in Indiana or Ohio or Michigan or wherever that might be, and you know, you're a high energy user. Energy beyond labor is probably one of your most expensive assets besides the commodities in which you're dealing with, and we're exceptionally uncompetitive. That's something we really need to look at. And just from, if it's about green energy, then let's make it about green energy. If it's about a particular industry, then make it about a particular industry, because the cheapest energy to produce that's green, that's carbon free, is not solar, it's wind. And you know, wind is maybe a little more unique asset that you can still farm around it. You don't lose the general use of the land. Where solar is, it's gone. So I don't know if that answered your question. Maybe I got a little on the soapboxy.
I was on the conference committee, and most of our time in energy was spent on trying to get rid of bad policy. We did have some good policy, and we will continue to pursue that. But I know that some of the policy they want is going to come back again next year, and hopefully we don't spend most of our time trying to get rid of bad policy. We get some options to put in some newer policy that helps, especially our rural areas. We're getting hammered pretty hard, and so there's things that could be done. And Senator Osmick he's a pretty tough, I mean, he'll hang right in there. And so I think there's some opportunity, but you know, it's going to take some time. Biggest thing we have to control is some of the new policy that the administration and the House DFL want to put in play, because that would really make it tough and drive our prices rather drastically quickly. Yep. Other questions? Brad?
One of the last times you were in this room, we had a discussion on childcare.
Yes.
Along with Senator Weber. I know Senator Weber took the lead on some childcare legislation. Where did we end up with that?
So we did,
hang on a minute.
yeah, I'll take it, Gary.
We did several things this year to try to make some changes. Partially in rulemaking, we put a lot of dollars in different areas through grants and things like that to encourage and increase the development of daycares, especially in rural Minnesota. CCAP, that's the area where there was a lot of dollars that were mistakenly gathered and then not used properly, as one way to put that. And what we've done there is we've put in a 16-step process that Health and Human Services has to go through and identify these areas and these issues and the corrections for them, and they have like a year to do that. And the funding has been set stable. We're not increasing the funding there until we figure out exactly where this money's going and how it's being used and if it's properly being used. Yet it's not going to hurt the folks that are using CCAP dollars, because it's the same dollars as we've had in the past. But it gives us a little breather in there to try to figure out what's going on. But there are several programs that have been implemented this year that once they get fully going should help quite a bit, and certainly in rural Minnesota with some of the grants that we'll see available. Yep.
Yeah, one of the areas we were trying to work on was just change the ratios. So that was one of the things that was talked quite a bit from the providers that came to that meeting. And what we found is a lot of those aren't necessarily set in statute. And so we went into session with some ideas of let's change those numbers just through statute. And, you know, I have a problem with rulemaking, but there's some areas which maybe it makes a little bit of sense. And so what we need to do is, you know, change the culture a little bit and change the dynamic within the agency so that those rules will potentially move forward where, hey, for this particular situation, let's open this up to make it a different type of ratio. So like one of the big issues was if you have a helper, so let's say you can have 12 and 2. So you can have two youngsters and then 12 older kids if you're just by yourself. But if you have an employee with, you can only increase that by about 2 people. Well, that doesn't, the cost versus ratio to actually bring an employee on or someone to increase your numbers, to increase access so that we have more spots for kids, we need to be able to change that and encourage, you know, within the agencies to move that number up so that you actually have a little bit better benefit to bring somebody into your business to help so that you can cover and help more kids and families. So I think particularly that's one of the things we heard, and we just found a lot of difficulty in that particular area to increase those numbers to make a little bit more sense. And I've had a bill on the bottom side to just get rid of the regulation, to say, you know, hey, if we, you know, we just from a personal experience, when we were first starting our family, my wife was still working outside the home, and we had an issue where we had a friend who was also a friend of my sister who said, yeah, well, I'll watch your kids, you know, 1 day a week or whatever. But the problem was that she couldn't watch children from 2 different families, even though it was 1 kid from each family, just do it. And to me, it's like, we can have a little bit of common sense here where if you're friends and you understand who these people are, it shouldn't be viewed as a crime to watch children and pay them without any state regulation or a state license from 2 different families. And so that's one particular area that I think some common sense would come into the room. And granted, yeah, that's maybe a little bit of common sense, but it's maybe changes the dynamic with a competition standpoint. But the issue is not a mom watching two kids from 2 different families. The issue is when it comes to, you know, public education and early funding dollars not following kids. And I think that's one of the areas that we could really see a big difference in making sure these small businesses stay going, is allow those dollars to follow the child and the family. So if that kid feels, or that parent feels they want to continue that relationship they have with their child care provider, once they get to a preschool age, those dollars should follow that kid and not necessarily be forced within a school public program. I think that would make a big difference in keeping those businesses going, because that's why a lot of that stuff's being forwarded. If you remember, you know, the child care unionization that Governor Dayton pushed forward many years ago, some of these policies are a direct relation to that, as almost a, hey, okay, you don't want that, well, this is what you're going to get instead. And essentially it's done what it's wanted to, is destroy those small businesses. So
I think another thing that we saw in these meetings that went around the state was the implementation of the rules and regulations varied drastically from county to county and throughout the state. And that's one of the things that we really worked on this year, is try to get those rules the same no matter where you're at, and not so much variation from county to county. Other questions? Cliff?
Just maybe just in a real general sense, not so much specific to this last legislative session, any particular issue. Any insights you can provide us on what we can expect going forward? We have a new governor, and it's not the same as the Dayton administration. Any insights you learned from this session that is, I have some really specific concerns about representative government. If you look at the state of Minnesota and you see the red that's in the rural areas and what happened in this last election, what can we expect so that, one of the specific questions I had was, you know, if you spend $1 on transportation, how much of that is actually coming to the rural? How much of that have you learned from this last legislative session, what we can expect moving forward?
Well, I think you're seeing, you know, a general dynamic change across the country in some areas where you're seeing a lot less competition between the parties in rural areas where the public has just gotten probably a bit more conservative. We've had, I mean, just within my short period of time in the legislature, we had areas where there was a competitive district in rural Minnesota that hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on a race, and it was really close. And, you know, a few years later, it's not even a competition. And now you have some areas within the metro and the suburban areas. I mean, just from an agricultural standpoint, in a microcosm, you talk about transportation, but ag is a good importance. Like, you just have less people that are connected to the farm. And so you see that in policy, particularly, we saw that in the Jobs Committee. So the Jobs, Energy, Commerce, / whatever committee, conference committee, those appointees were all within about 20 miles of each other in the metro.
For the DFL
For the
side.
DFL side.
Yeah.
And so, you know, granted, there was some opportunity that they could have diversified that so they could have a rural perspective. And so that was a really good indicator where I feel that's going. Because energy policy, particularly, you know, we have rural co-ops. Just as you have a cooperative for agreement within the education, you guys kind of, in areas where each individual district can kind of have their own staff person, you fill in the gaps and say, hey, we'll bring these people together, we'll bring these talent sets together so that they can serve a wider area so it makes better economic sense. That is a big concern of mine, is that once you kind of get metro-centric, we've seen that in a lot of different areas, it stays that way. And so and that's what, I mean, particularly in energy, that's what bothered me, is you had huge issues. You were having big mandates on rural cooperative electric companies and rural municipal generation facilities like the city of Marshall from an electrical perspective, yet you had absolutely no one from those areas that represented it that are going to be the decision makers on that, from that side. And so that's a problem, because if you're willing to do something and not allow that voice in on your side of the aisle, you really need to, and listen to those things, because they're real concerns, whether it be transportation funding. I mean, if your focus is that, then you're going to be talking about light rail only, or bus routes only. And you know, transit's a big issue, or education is the same mindset. You know, yeah.
I think one thing is that what we're seeing is our population out here shift, and we're seeing a lot of growth in the metro area. And I'm not sure if it'll happen this redistricting, but I wouldn't be surprised that rural Minnesota loses a Senate seat, which would mean we would lose a seat out here and 2 House members, and it would be that much more strength they would have in the metro area. And, you know, I applaud the governor for wanting to do, you know, talking about one Minnesota, and we still hear a lot about one Minnesota. But if we look at the policy that the DFL had and look at a lot of the things the governor had in his budget, it's truly not a one Minnesota. And so I think part of the reason maybe we've seen more red coming out here is that I think a lot of people in Minnesota start realizing how shortchanged we're getting on the dollars. When you take a look at education, and we have schools out here with their with all of the programs and stuff on the formula plus all of the additional stuff, and they're around that $10,000 a student. You get into the 7-county metro area, and that's probably around $16,000. Then you get a couple of schools in the metro area that's up over $20,000. Now, it's hard to justify why a school in rural Minnesota should be getting $10,000 when somebody else is getting $20,000. And so what it amounts to is our students out here don't have the access to a lot of the programs that you would have in the cities. And I personally don't think that's fair. And that's why we fight so hard to keep it on the formula. But I think a lot of people are realizing that we're getting shortchanged when it comes to Medicaid payments. We get shortchanged on education. We're getting shortchanged on transportation. And people are saying we need to start trying to get our fair share. And so I think that's part of that process. However, it makes it tougher if we start losing more seats out here. It makes it tougher to get the balance out here, but that's something we have to certainly continue to work on.
One more question.
One more, and then we gotta go. Yeah.
One of the big things is you're talking about here is we're losing population.
Yes.
We're kowtowing to corporate ag, which gets people off the farm. Our roads are falling apart. We aren't getting a percentage of the money to come out here to fix our roads. It needs to be in the dedicated funds. You know, when you put money in that isn't constitutionally dedicated, it doesn't necessarily get distributed the same way it does. It is. Sure that it is?
Yes,
sure?
it is. Yes.
Well, it needs to be, because we need our roads fixed. We need daycare.
Yep.
We need affordable housing. We need jobs. We need reasons for people to stay out here.
Yep.
And when we
Yep.
always talk about, well, we're going to win with this and we're going to win with that, when does it come to, let's just do the people's business, do the right thing by our communities, and just do, you know, I know that's what you're trying to do, but, you know.
Well, I don't know, we put close to $100 million in low-income housing this year, and a lot of that's gonna go to rural Minnesota. I mean, you know, and you talk about transportation. Now, whether the money is dedicated or not, the key is the formula.
Right.
And it's hard to get that changed because there's a lot of factors in there. So we've been trying to get the formula changed so we get more money out here. We've made some little inroads, but there's still quite a ways to go. But it's a process that takes some time, and I know people have been working on it for a long time, but we just have to continue to work on it. And that's what we have to do in order to make Minnesota stronger. I think that over the last 2-3 bienniums, I think we have done a lot of things to help rural Minnesota. We still got a long ways to go.
Yes, we do.
So
I think, Al, you brought up a good point, you know, from a perspective of population growth and where we're going. You know, it's not necessarily an issue of jobs. We have a lot of jobs available. We need people too. And
Right.
whether it be quality of
It takes
life,
housing.
but it takes a lot of different things too. You know, from a hospital perspective, when it comes to recruiting doctors, our tax policy forces those hospitals to pay the same provider to come to Minnesota who's operating currently in South Dakota 7 to 10% more, just to make up the difference so that they're at least on an equal playing field from an economic standpoint. And so from a quality of life standpoint, you know, things like the Merit Center and things like the Red Baron Arena are all important keys and factors of that, state parks and the rest. But, you know, it's a common thing that we always deal with that, you know, I remember talking to a recruiter a couple years back from a large business here in town that was recently sold. I'm not going to name names. You can guess. But they said a big issue they have is just the spouse too, is that they can maybe get a person that's willing to come here and be an executive and do the large corporate work that they do. But sometimes the male or female spouse won't even get out of the car to look at the job or the housing opportunity or the school because of where we're at. And so what we need to do is create a fertile playing ground that if we do have families or people or small businesses that want to come here, what do we need to do? Well, broadband funding is one of those things that say, hey, if I'm an individual business, if I'm a salesperson, that I'm being told to be quiet. But, you know, having that kind of thing, and so I think we made that was an investment that made, and we've made it ongoing. But I want to thank everybody for coming. Have a great day, and I pray for good dry weather and hot for a while to dry the ground out, and enjoy your summer if you're in education and whatever that might be. So,
and
catch
again,
some fish.
I'd like to thank the Chamber for hosting this and YMCA for letting us use the facilities. And thank you folks for coming out. We do appreciate it. And you know how to get a hold of Chris and I, so any other questions or anything, feel free to get a hold of us. And thank you folks for being here.